and making space for it. JWA is a digital archive because we believe that making this broader, more inclusive history accessible to people around the world, wherever you are, is essential, because ultimately this history belongs to each of us. It shouldn't be locked up in a space that's meant only for scholars and experts. And we do that through many different ways. I encourage you to check out our site to see the educational materials and the podcast and encyclopedia, online exhibits, oral history collections, all kinds of learning opportunities, programs for teens, a blog. There's much there, and I'm not going to go into detail about any of that, but I hope this will whet your appetite to check it out further. But what I want to talk about tonight is, how did we come to a place, a time when a full series on women writing Torah is not only imaginable and possible, but probably overrun with options for speakers, more options for speakers than you could possibly accommodate in one series. I'm sure it's been difficult for all of you who are planning this to even figure out how to make space for all the possibilities of what you could cover. Even the pioneering Jewish feminists of the 1970s did not initially begin with this kind of creative flourishing in mind. They began, as most excluded populations do, with a fight for access. Let us learn the holy texts. Let us study to be rabbis. Let us be part of ritual life. Let us lead communities. Let us be full members, actually, of synagogues. Let us take on public roles in the synagogue and in the broader community. We want a seat at the table. And that was it from at the beginning. But very quickly, they realized that it wasn't just about getting a seat at the table. It was actually about what happens next, when women are full participants in the conversation, when their voices are given their due. And what happens is that women change the conversation. Women bring new perspectives. They challenge the received wisdom based on their own insights and experiences. They advocate for priorities that weren't valued before. One of the examples that I think of in this context is from the Rabbi Laura Geller, who was the third woman ordained in the Reform movement and the first woman to serve as the senior rabbi of a major metropolitan synagogue in Los Angeles. And when she was in rabbinical school, this was in the early 70s, mid 70s, her Talmud professor began their class, as he had for decades, by declaring, "There is no important moment in the lifetime of a Jew for which there is no blessing." And at first she thought, oh my gosh, that's so deep. Of course, that's amazing. We have a moment, we have a blessing for every moment in Judaism. And then she realized, pretty much her second thought was realizing that, of course, she had had many moments as a girl and later as a woman that were not acknowledged by Jewish ritual or liturgy in any way. And that this was not actually true. This was true of men's experience maybe, but not of her experience. So that realization, not just Rabbi Geller's realization, but the realization of all women who gained access to Jewish life in a new way and realized that the traditional narrative didn't necessarily encompass their experiences, that unleashed a flood of creativity. And so we see in the later years of the 70s and the 80s and on, new rituals, new interpretations, new liturgy, new midrash, new definitions of communal priorities, all of which have immeasurably expanded the category of Torah. And I think it's important to note that even those who thought that they were not revolutionaries, who thought that they just wanted to be in the room to sit quietly and learn, became agents of transformation in Jewish life. Now, I'm not a rabbi or a theologian or a midrashist. I'm a historian. So my preferred Jewish texts are the texts and stories of history. So I want to tell you two quick stories that show what can happen when we center women's stories, especially in a Jewish context. And the first example is from labor history. Jewish women in the garment industry in the early 20th century transformed the labor movement. How did they do that? Women had traditionally been excluded from unions because male leaders assumed that women would not make good union members because they would only be in the workforce for a short time, and then they would go on to get married and leave the factory. This was a big miscalculation on the part of the men because they did not realize that women cared about the labor movement, first of all, because they were invested in their work, even if they were only going to be doing it for a few years. And they were continued to be involved. They continued to care about what happened in the labor movement, even after they left the factory, because they were invested in the communities and families that they were part of, and they often managed the family finances. They had a much bigger picture beyond their immediate moment. So in fact, when women had the opportunity to insert themselves into the labor movement, they became excellent, committed members and leaders. And their presence in the movement broadened the definition of what they were fighting for. Men had focused primarily on the basics, pay, hours, maybe some working conditions. Women tended to think a bit more broadly, not only more broadly about what working conditions meant. So for example, taking into account not being harassed by your boss, which wasn't something that men were particularly attentive to, but also about things that seemed perhaps small and simple, like having a place to hang your hat so it wouldn't get dirty or crushed, so that when you left the factory at the end of the day, you could feel like a clean and dignified person. They also thought of things like education and leisure activities, like having a theater troupe in the union or a working women's camp where you could get some fresh air and hear lectures from all kinds of speakers. This is what the leading organizer, Rose Schneiderman, called bread and roses. She famously said, "The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too." Meaning you must, of course, have the basics for survival, but you also have to have the beautiful things that make life worth living and that give you a sense of dignity. And that perspective, which I would call the Torah of women workers, which many male union leaders scoffed at as bringing trivial concerns to the union conversation, actually transformed the movement. It brought in tens of thousands more people who began to understand a bigger picture of the life that they were fighting for. The second story is a more personal one about how the story of one woman's life can help someone understand their own life differently. This is the story of pioneering feminist Gloria Steinem and her grandmother, Pauline Perlmutter Steinem. Pauline died when Gloria was just 5 years old, but Gloria grew up hearing stories about her, about how her grandmother was this wonderful balabusta who kept a kosher home, who raised 4 sons, who was active in her local Jewish community. What she didn't hear from her family as she was growing up was that her grandmother was also an early feminist. She was a suffragist who had addressed Congress. She had traveled abroad as a delegate to the International Council of Women in 1908. She was the first woman elected to public office in Toledo, Ohio, where she lived. She learned these things from a historian. She didn't learn them from her own family. As you might imagine, Gloria was surprised and delighted to discover that she had a feminist foremother in her own family. And learning about her grandmother's feminism also reconnected Gloria with her Jewish heritage. She came to understand that her Jewish roots were, in fact, also her feminist roots. And that brought a bit of a sense of her own Torah into her life. I also just want to point out that it seems particularly fitting that that gift of rediscovering her grandmother or discovering her in a new way was given to her by other women who are unearthing the lost history of women. So the last thing I want to say is about that lost history, and I will wrap up with this. I began by implying that the story of women writing Torah began in the 1970s and 80s. And of course, that is absolutely not true. That's when the modern publicly acknowledged wave of women writing Torah began. But what I want to say is that women have always written Torah. We may have lost most of it, or we think we have because we don't know exactly where to look or how to find it. It wasn't written down necessarily, or where it was written wasn't saved. But I believe very fiercely, my studies of history have shown me that there are not new questions really that we ask. Women have always been writing Torah. They've been asking many of the same questions that we ask of texts today. It's not a modern invention. Historians have begun to uncover it. I believe we will continue to find the voices of women and the insights of women as we learn better how to look for them. And so in addition to writing our own Torah, I think that recovering the lost Torah of women is part of our work too. And I hope that this series will be one way that we can support one another in doing so.
Wow, thank you so much, Judith. There's so much to think about. I never before thought about women in unions in connection to the endeavor of women writing about Torah. So that's really mind-blowing to me. There's so much to unpack in terms of what it means to have foremothers who you can relate to in a different way and can give meaning to your own identity. And I think a lot of what we are trying to do is to try to center those stories so that we can draw inspiration from it. That's only one of the things. But hopefully over the course of this series, we can think about it some more. And hopefully you can uncover those historical voices of women who have done this before and bring them to us. So thank you so much. We are really delighted that tonight we have a modern midrashist. We have somebody who writes her own midrash, Dr. Michal Lemberger. I am just going to, before I held up the Tanakh, and that tells one version of some of these stories. And now I also want to hold up Dr. Michal Lemberger's book, beautiful book called After Abel. I encourage you to buy it and to read the stories.
Good morning. And a very good day to you, my miss. Hi.
Yes, okay. What Michal does is take the stories of women in Tanakh and center them and try to imagine, well, what was the wife of Lot thinking? What was Eve thinking? What does it mean to be the mother of all living beings, and then to have her son Hevel die, right, and her son Cain have to leave? Things that, I've studied the story of Eve so many times, but I never thought about questions like this. And I think it's just a wonderful thing that now that women are writing Torah, they're starting to look at questions that a woman's perspective would really bring to the forefront. So Michal, we are so excited to have you come and teach us tonight. Michal Lemberger's debut collection, After Abel and Other Stories, was named a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, honorable mention for the American Library Association Sophie Brody Medal, and a National Jewish Book Club pick. Her fiction has appeared in the Nervous Breakdown, Litro, is that how you pronounce it? Litro, New York? And Lilith Magazine.
Sorry, Litro.
Okay, like literature. Got it. Okay. Poetry, essays, and journalism have appeared widely in publications, including the Bellevue Literary Review, The Rattling Wall, Real Simple, and Slate. She lives in Los Angeles, and we're so happy to have you here with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Before I start, first I'll say thank you again to those who organized this, Ariel, Aliza, Willa behind the scenes for inviting me. But I want to say I'm so thrilled by how many people are here, and I cannot see all of you. So I say that only because I like to have an inclusive conversation where people can speak up. But if I can't see you, I can't call on you. So maybe I can ask somebody else to sort of keep an eye out for people who raise their electronic hands. I think best to use the reaction, right? Down at the bottom, if you press reaction plus, you can raise your hand. It says raise hand right there. And then somebody can call on you because I can't see all of you. And I regret that. As much as I am thrilled to have so many people here, I just can't see everyone. By the same token, I'm not going to keep my chat open because that will block people's faces. So again, if you have questions and you put them in the chat, perhaps somebody could relay them to me. Okay, so first of all, thank you for coming. I see at least one familiar face, which is exciting, and many, many new faces, which is even more exciting. I'm not a historian. I'm an English major. That's my degree is in English. I study literature. I teach literature. I write literature, and I approach texts from a literary perspective. All texts, including Jewish texts, including the Torah, including the rest of the Bible. And in fact, I was teaching this for many, many years. I was teaching what in secular universities they call Bible as literature, which is really not just Bible as literature. It's history and anthropology and archaeology, and all of it sort of mixed together to look at the way the Bible is constructed as a text. So the extra biblical sources, the patterns within the language, the way stories are structured, the way language is used. And I taught that for quite a few years. And what happens when you teach something for quite a few years is you read it many, many times. And of course, the Bible's a big fat book, which, by the way, if you've never read, I highly recommend. It's a great book. So I read it a lot of times. I also read a lot of scholarship. I read a lot of commentary, and it kind of, you marinate in something. Every single person here has an expertise in something, from career to a hobby to child rearing to caring for elders, whatever it is, you've all developed some expertise. And so you know it sort of, as my grandmother would say, in your kishkas. Right? You know these things so well. And that's what happened for me with these biblical stories. I wrote my dissertation on 20th century poetic interpretations of the first 3 chapters of Genesis. So that's the 2 creation stories and the Eden stories. And that's it. Because a dissertation is a very narrow, deep dive. But poets love Lot's wife, love her. And there's a lot to love. The pillar of salt is a really resonant image. It's mysterious and heartbreaking and very visual. So poets really love it and love her. They love the idea of looking back and what that gesture means, to look back, and what it means to be punished, specifically for looking back. So I had read tons of these poems, but I couldn't fit it into my dissertation because, as I said, the dissertation, narrow but deep, not wide. Shouldn't fit. She's Genesis 19. That does not fit into the first 3 chapters. And I think she just sort of stayed there in my head. During all those years that I was teaching, she just hung out, without me really noticing her there. And then I was teaching this material and teaching this material and teaching this material, and it all of a sudden struck me. Oh, I know how that story goes. And that was it. That really was it. That was how this book began, with that sentence. Oh, I know how this story goes. And what I understood in that moment was that I had learned the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and of Lot's wife from a very traditional perspective. And the traditional Jewish perspective is that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, the reason Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, was because of a lack of hospitality. That the people of Sodom, specifically Sodom, were selfish. They didn't welcome visitors. And then we're going to look at the story and you'll see that. But that was really as far as it went. In fact, if you look at the Talmudic treatment of the destruction of Sodom, you're going to see a lot of really creative interpretations of what they did wrong. They charged two coins to cross the river by ferry, and 4 if they didn't use the ferry. So that, damned if you do and damned if you don't. And one of the daughters of Lot saw this, what we would call, an unhoused person who was very needy. And the law was you couldn't give anything to anyone, and she would sneak him food. And when they found out how he was surviving, they wanted to kill her. So really, the Talmudists like to go overboard in many, many ways. And in this, they're not. This is no exception. But that's the traditional Jewish approach to the destruction, fire and brimstone destruction of this entire community. Now, Christian commentaries, of course, are very stuck on the idea of sodomy. That's where the concept and the word for sodomy is based in terms of the biblical text. There's no sodomy in the story of Sodom, incidentally. It doesn't happen. One commentator noticed the the plight of Lot's daughters. One, so far as I can find. I'm a little ashamed. I'm embarrassed for Jewish men historically for not noticing this. And we will go through it and see it. But there is this moment in the story where Lot says, take my daughters. And I'm going to start sharing my screen in just a moment, and we'll look at what it means to say, take my daughters. But I had a visceral reaction to that sentence. And I have 2 daughters. And I said, oh, hell no. Oh, hell no. And I thought, what would I do if somebody tried to do that to my daughters? And it was very clear to me. And am I allowed to use salty language? Ariel said yes, Aliza said, I said to myself, and I did use salty language that I will leave out. You can fill it in where you think it goes. But I said I would burn the town down. That's what I would do. And so she does. In my version, she does. It is fire and brimstone. She sees herself as acting as the agent of God, but she burns the town down to save her daughters. And of course, there are really unexpected and horrible results that come from her decision. And that's part of the story as well. But what I want to talk about is how we each take ownership of these stories. And please excuse my momentary lapses. I keep getting texts and they come into my computer, so I have to get rid of them, but they ding and it's a little distracting, but I'm trying not to let it distract me. You each own these texts. It's not just me. I happen to be a writer, so I wrote it down and put it out into the world, but these texts belong to each of us. In Deuteronomy, we read the key point about all of Jewish commentary, which is, it is not in heaven. It is here on earth. And the Talmudic rabbis use that as the basis for everything that comes afterwards, which is, we have the right to intervene in the text itself. We have the right to look at the text and decide what it means. It is not in heaven. Now, of course, the rabbis of the Talmud and their descendants used that precept to maintain and guard their own authority. They didn't use it to give it to us. And we should be very, very clear about that. And we should thank the women who came before us, because they're the ones who opened this up so that the world caught up with the really high valued esteem that the rabbis gave to individual interaction. Now it really does belong to us. For a long time, it was, in theory, it belongs to everyone, but in reality, women really didn't have ownership, but now we really do. So that means that each of us get to say, wait, I see something here. I see something that maybe nobody has thought of before, or maybe somebody has thought of, but nobody's thought of it the way I have thought of it. And I get to put that out into the world, whether it's in a book or talking in a breakout room or sitting over a meal, whatever it is, we get to say it. So I want to go through Genesis chapter 19 with you, part of it, and show you what it is I look for in terms of how to insert your own notions into the text. And what's really important, I'm going to start sharing my screen. What's really important is that what we understand is there are gaps in the text. That's not because the writers left the gaps. It's because, by definition, texts have gaps that later generations step into. But it's also because of the style of the Bible. The Bible is very pared down. It's very sparse, which means that we can see each passage as a brick, but the mortar around the brick has to be replaced every once in a while. It breaks down, gets crumbly. We come in, we have the ability to come in and say, well, what do I see as fitting into that gap? So let's look at this text. For those of you not following along here on SVIVAH, and that's what I'm using here. It's an open source website that contains texts, Jewish texts. There are many other translations. I'm going to use the SVIVAH translation for ease. But if you want to follow along in your own text, it's Genesis chapter 19. That's all we're looking at. So I'm going to just start to read, and I'll stop every once in a while. Now, if anyone has anything to add or to ask, please raise your hands, and I'm going to ask the other people who are looking out for this stuff to let me know, because I do want feedback, and I do want your gears to get going. If they don't, and you're happy to have me keep talking, I'm happy to do it. But it would be great to have other people step in. So here's what's happened. Before chapter 19, God comes to Abraham and says, the city of Sodom is irreparably evil. I'm going to destroy it. And Abraham negotiates God down and says things like, but what if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Would you destroy a whole town if there were 50? And God says, no, I won't destroy if there are 50. And God gets down to one person. And as we know, Sodom is destroyed. So they couldn't even find one righteous person in Sodom. So already I have questions. Maybe you have questions. Maybe this is your gap. What does that mean to say there's no righteous person? Does that mean there's no innocent person? What about the children? What about the sick? What does it mean to lump everyone under this label of evil? Because we've seen it before. We saw it with the flood. The whole world was destroyed. Only Noah survived. He was the only righteous one. Well, that seems to exclude a lot of people who don't have the ability to be righteous. So there's a question. Maybe that gets your mind going. But now God sends some angels to Sodom to save Lot, who is Abraham's relative. The two angels arrived in Sodom in the evening as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to greet them, and bowing low with his face to the ground, he said, please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house to spend the night and bathe your feet. Then you may be on your way early. But they said, no, we will spend the night in the square. So all sorts of things happening here. Again, I don't have that much time, so I'm going to just touch on things and keep going. I do want to say the gate of a city is very important in the Bible. It's where judgment happens. It's where the city elders meet. So Lot is sitting there. He's a pretty important guy. This, please, my lords, turn aside and, come be my guest. That echoes things we've seen from his relative Abraham, who welcomes people in. It's also just this very important precept in the Bible. It's welcoming the stranger. And also when we say angels, that's a really ambiguous term in the text, because it could be, angels with the wings and all that, but most people see it more as messengers, because they clearly are not treated like supernatural beings. They're people. They look like people anyway. So now, maybe we're in a sci-fi land a little bit. Also interesting. No, we will spend the night in the square. All I see is stone soup. You know that story of stone soup, right? The people show up and nobody's willing to give them any food. And the older one says to the younger one, go get me a stone, a nice big hefty stone. And they they heat up a pot in the middle of the square and they put the stone in and they say, oh, we're going to have such delicious stone soup. And everybody starts slowly bringing something out, some onions and some carrots and some meat and in the end, they have a giant feast with all the stuff. So to me, this is the setup for stone soup. Again, what do you make of that? This isn't the story I wrote, but maybe there's another story here. Maybe stone soup really does come from this. Maybe that's a midrash that we've lost the origins of. Anyway, keep going. But he urged them strongly, so they turned his way and entered his house. He prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Unleavened bread, we think of as matzah. Of course, what we're learning here is he did it quickly. He wanted to feed them right away. So you could say perhaps that he's very eager to be a good host. He wants to feed them so quickly. They had not yet lain down when the townspeople, the men of Sodom, young and old, all the people to the last man, gathered about the house. Here's where my BS meter goes up a little bit. Again, Eliza, no salty language. I'm trying very hard. All the people to the last man. Well, wait a minute. Is it all the people or is it all the men? And it is pretty clear that it's all the men. So already we are understanding something about the culture of this town, if not this entire period. People equals men. To me, that is significant. That says the understanding of humankind is already limited, either by the text itself or by the culture that's being examined here, the culture of Sodom. And they shouted to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may be intimate with them." Okay, intimate, not a great word. That we may know them. That's the standard translation. It is indeed the way sexual intimacy is discussed, and that's the word used, ned'a otam, that we will know them. It does mean intimacy, sexual intimacy, or in this case, seems less intimate than violent, but sexuality, but it can also mean not sexuality. It can mean both. So the fact that the traditions of two major religions, I can't speak to Islam because I just don't know well enough, have understood this to only mean sexual is, again, an interesting point. It's a gap for me in imagination, because what if that's not what they meant? Not because it's not possible. It is entirely possible that this is such a culture of degradation that is actually what they meant, that these two strangers have come to town, therefore we're going to rape them. But can't we think about this a little bit more interestingly? Can't we think about it in terms of what we've learned about the town? They're not hospitable. What does that mean to be not hospitable? Because the rabbis are right, they aren't hospitable. So what does it mean? Does it mean just we're depraved, or does it mean something else? That's just a question. Okay, let's keep going. So Lot went out to them to the entrance, shut the door behind him, and said, "I beg you, my friends, do not commit such a wrong." This is, now we're really getting into scene setting here, because now we can see it. We see him nervously pull the door closed behind him and hold his hands up and say, "Don't do this, don't do this. Look," and here's the key moment, "I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you please. But do not do anything to these men, since they have come under the shelter of my roof." So I'm going to actually now say to you, what do you make of that passage? Eliza, would you just bring somebody in? Because I can't see people.
Sure, I'm looking around. Raise your hand if you want to say something.
Okay, I see Tamara Hal or Hallie. Would you, do you want to speak? That would be great.
Sure. I pronounce it Tamara Hallie.
Tamara.
I think what that means to me is that for Lot, he honored and valued these strangers, visitors he just met that night, above his own children.
Great. Thank you.
for
Wonderful.
daughters in particular.
Wonderful. Thank you. Why don't you take down your hand once I've called on you? Because now I see two other people. Am I pronouncing this correctly? Maraji? Take yourself off mute, please. You're still on mute. You're still on mute. Maybe you have to turn up your volume. I'm not sure what's happening. Okay, now I think we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, it was my earphones. Okay, I see the same thing that Tamara saw, but also I see that for this to flow so freely from Lot's mouth, it must have been something that was ingrained in him, that it just came so naturally. So it was evidently part of the culture. He was not the only one that felt this way.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, why don't you lower your hand so that I don't call on you again. There's somebody else had a hand up. Don't be shy, please. No one else?
Lenny, did I see you?
I happen to know
Yeah,
that
I was going to make a remark about the culture. Several things. In that neck of the woods, there is a tradition of men being very friendly in a physical way with each other. They greet each other quite physically. So it wouldn't surprise me to have the sentence about the men getting to know them. It's business of valuing the daughters, not at all, is reflected in the text itself by the fact that they wrote this down and they couldn't find a soul. They couldn't find a single decent guy in the place.
Well, let's get to that later.
They even look for a woman. I mean,
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I will say about the physical affection. I take your point. I will just say I do think it's a mistake to say because we see it now, it was true in 13th century BCE, which is when this story is supposed to take place. But here's the thing, Lenny, even if that's not necessarily in the text because we don't know about the culture, that's the beginning of a beautiful way of thinking about it for you. So just because we say, well, maybe we have to be a little careful about that doesn't mean we discard it. Because, well, yeah, okay, well, what do we do with that? What do we do with that idea that this is a culture in which men show affection for men physically, but maybe don't for women? Well, then what does that tell us? I think that's fantastic. Really wonderful. I'm going to ask you both to mute yourself so I can call on somebody else because I see you're Daniel.
Yeah, sorry. I'm using my husband's iPad, but my name is Zan.
Hi, Zan.
Hi. I mean, I agree with what others have said. I think I always find this passage a bit horrifying. I was kind of, just like looking ahead a little, it's a little curious that the daughters are actually betrothed and that there are sons-in-law in the picture.
They're not. I'm glad you brought that up. Let me clear that up and then I'll let you talk a little bit more. There are other daughters. There are other daughters who are married because these two have never known a man. And then there are others who have husbands. Yeah. So now.
I think I definitely agree that it seems like this was sort of, the daughters are kind of on the table generally. I do kind of wonder if maybe like going back to the stone soup explanation that maybe it's possible that he thought that maybe this wasn't like the final offer in the negotiation, that maybe that was not really going to happen, but I have no idea.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. I will say two things that all of you have brought up these amazing points. So first of all, there is a horrifying story later in the Bible, in the book of Judges, where this happens again, and the woman is sent out. She's not a virgin daughter, which the virgin part also, again, my antenna go up a little bit. She's not a virgin. She's what they call a concubine. She's a common law wife. And she is sent out, and she is, not to put too fine a point on it, raped to death. She is gang raped to death. And in response, her husband, who has sent her out, cuts up her body and sends it out to the tribes, and it initiates a war. So the Bible often talks to itself. It's not a hermetically sealed text. If we see something in another place, we can then look at it side by side with what we're looking at now. So we know what would happen here because we see it elsewhere. We know that these two girls would be dead by the end of this night. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and I see both of you have your hands raised. Zan, are you still okay? So I see SJ. Don't know what that stands for, but I'm going to get to you in just a second. What I want to read ahead another two passages, and then I'm gonna call on you. But they said, "Stand back. The fellow," they said, "came here as an alien, and already he acts the ruler. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." And they pressed hard against the person of Lot and moved forward to break the door. But the men stretched out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. So there are a lot of different men here. So let me just clear that up. But they said, these are the people of the town. That the fellow, that's Lot. Lot came. He wasn't born there. Now he's an important guy in the city. He's sitting at the gate. To me, this reads as someone who has been there for a really long time, but is never really accepted. We know of cultures like that. You're still a newcomer after 60 years. And they say, now we're really going to get you now. In the next passage, but the men stretched out their hands. That's the visitors. That's the angels. I'm going to call on you, SJ, and then I'm going to ask a question about these two passages. All right. But take yourself off mute, please.
Torah is pretty brutal, okay, on a lot of ways. What if the intimation of intimacy is there for a purpose? What if the suggestion that this was to be a sexual act of some kind is there to warn off the rest of us?
I love this. Warn off in what way?
Well, these guys were so evil that they were going to take physical advantage of these newcomers. And therefore, since the town was already morally corrupt, it lays the groundwork for the destruction.
Yes.
When going on with the text, the men stretched out from inside the house and pulled Lot into the house and shut the door. In a sense, that separates Lot from the rest of the rabble outside.
Wonderful.
And all of a sudden, he might be redeemable, which he is because he goes out with a ram.
Well,
so maybe it's intentional.
Beautiful, really beautiful reading. I'm going to ask you to lower your hand so it doesn't keep coming up as raised hand. That is a beautiful reading. I would say that yes, the whole point of this story is to say, look, they really did deserve their fate. I think the initial text is trying to point us to this town deserves to be destroyed for many reasons. And I think your reading is fantastic. And I love that you put it in the phrase of a question, because questions lead to answers and answers lead to new ways of thinking. So here's my question. Where is Lot's wife in this?
Hiding in the house.
Okay, but she's not active. And there's the gap for me. That was the gap. Was Lot just said, take my daughters. They're virgin daughters, meaning they're young. They're young. And she's in the house. We know she exists because later on she's turned into a pillar of salt, but she does not appear here, which means that the story is on its face limited. We don't know her reaction. We don't know her feeling. We don't know if she is okay with this. We don't know if she objects to it, because she doesn't count toward the story. Notice, I see you. I see your hand. Give me a second. Notice that even in the end, she doesn't have a name. She never has a name. She's Lot's wife. That's it. So her feelings about the imminent murder by sexual violence of her 2 young daughters is not even glanced at, not for even a second. And to me, that's what's missing. And that's what my story came out of, that moment. SJ, what word are you called? But take yourself off mute, please.
Susan.
Okay, Susan, what
Okay.
do you have
I also write midrash, but I look at this from the point of view of the custom of the time, and that is, of course, Lot's wife isn't heard. Even Sarah hides behind the curtain when the angels are telling her she's going to get pregnant.
Well, they don't tell her, they tell him.
They tell him, but she hears it and laughs. But you normally don't see the reaction of the women. The women are sequestered, even as far back as biblical times. For the most part, if they were even remotely prosperous, the women are sequestered and are not in the public eye. To me, at least, it's not surprising that she doesn't have a voice. I would like her to have a voice. I think it's great to give her a voice, in Midrash. But in the reality of the writing here, if they're writing from the point of view of the time, even, 3,000 years ago, no, it's very unusual that the matriarchs have voice at all.
Well, okay, I am going to let everybody else speak, and then I'm going to respond to what you said, because you bring up really good points. So, Lila, if you could both turn on your video and unmute yourself, that would be great, so we can see while you're talking.
I can unmute, but I can't seem to get that video on. So
okay, well then let's just hear what you have to say. I'm sure.
Sorry. I think that Lot is an anomaly from the get-go. First of all, the crime is that they're inhospitable. He welcomes these 2 strangers in, which is hospitality. Mm-hmm. And now he's strangely invested in protecting them. And I don't understand why. What would be the consequence? He has to be sharp enough that he is now making a deal with the devil. So he's decided that he's going to protect these 2 strangers. He knows nothing about their power. He knows nothing at all about them. And he's going to trade off his daughters to protect these 2 men. Why?
Okay, that's a really good question. I'm going to ask you to lower your hand. One of the things that we know about ancient cultures is that the ethic of hospitality was very, very strongly rooted, so that you really did owe your guests as much as you could to ensure their happiness and their comfort and their safety. Travel was not taken lightly. It took a long time to get places. It was dangerous. There were bandits. If you got sick, there was no one to treat your sickness. People died on the road. There were all sorts of dangers, not to mention, wild animals. And so the traveler, when he or she got somewhere, was really given refuge, because they had just done something monumental. People the Bible can trick us into thinking that travel was something that was a regular thing. It was not. There were people who traveled regularly. The Phoenicians sailed as far as Crete, that we know, even further, maybe even Spain. And there were people trading probably to China, even that far. And there were trade routes and there were caravan routes. Those were people who traveled. Everyone else pretty much stayed put because, again, it was hard and it was expensive and it was dangerous. So on that score, we do know that. But you bring up another question. Why does he value them more? Value them, yes, but value them more, right? Not what does that say about his attitude toward the men, but what does that say about his attitude toward the daughters? We can really think about, well, what does that mean? Were they just possessions? Is that how he saw them? Was it somewhere between a possession and like a form of barter currency? How did he view them? All right. Did I pronounce your name correctly, Maraji? So take yourself off mute and then make sure I want to make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. Can't hear you. Sorry.
There we go. You got my name right both times.
Terrific.
No worries. No worries. I want to go back to your earlier question, if I may, about where was Lot's wife in all of this? And I don't mean this to sound frivolous as it may come out sounding, but knowing how at least most women of my acquaintance, and I don't know if this is general or not, are good problem solvers and, used to running the home and things like that. It seems to me that Lot's wife was probably off somewhere devising an exit strategy, trying to figure out how they're going to get out of this situation.
Sorry about that. I know you just saw that. That was horrible, but I'm getting so many texts. It's driving me crazy. I was listening to you, Maraji.
Okay.
I think you're right. I think that is really the start of where I came from as well. That they are problem solvers, that they're saying that she's back there plotting.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Now, so I'm going to ask you to lower your hand and I'm going to respond to Susan and say, one of my bedrock understandings of what it means to engage with this text is to say every text is like a movie or like a play where we follow the people in the front, we follow the protagonists, but everybody else are in the back, all those background characters, they all have lives. They all have full stories that they are living. And that what our goal in telling our stories is what we're doing is we're moving the spotlight. We're saying we're not paying attention to you anymore. Now we're paying attention to somebody else. And so whether or not they really were sequestered, because at some points in history they were and at some points in history they weren't, doesn't matter. If that's the start of your story about it, great. And then when you say, okay, she's inside, she's sequestered, then what? What's the next step? Since you write Midrash, write that. I think that's fantastic. What then? Now that you say, well, she's sequestered, she's not allowed to go outside. Did she meet the visitors? Does she even know that Lot has done this? How many people are in the household? Where is she sequestered? Does she have feelings about this? Does she? And Susan, I'm not asking you to answer because I think you and I could talk all night and we would, really hijack this discussion. But the point is, push those questions, because if you push those questions, you get to something new and something interesting. Now, somebody else just had her hand up. Carol, maybe?
Michal, before Carol speaks, could you unshare your screen so we can see everybody?
Yes, I was going to go back. I can go back after. Again, I apologize for that texting moment.
It's adorable. It doesn't mean
13 texts to talk about really something that I don't need to talk about right now. Carol Rose, you had a question.
An observation.
Okay, observation, fantastic.
I think you just said it. We're kind of shifting a whole narrative. We're looking at a text and shifting the focus. So women weren't in focus, or the spotlight wasn't on those characters.
That's
and so
right.
We're shifting a whole narrative.
Yes.
And that's really an invitation. It may be a flaw, but we now are invited into this process, and that becomes an exciting challenge to shift the narrative in the way that the Mists of Avalon shifted the narrative of King Arthur's court.
Right.
And, you know, nothing short of fantastic things can emerge.
That's right. You are 100% right. And that is exactly the point. The point, as you so beautifully put it, is that when we shift the narrative, when we look at somebody who has for millennia been consigned to the background, been consigned to silence, the story takes on whole new meanings and whole new valences. It is revealed to us in different ways. It doesn't necessarily change what's happening at the front of the stage. It's now your theater in the round. So what was the front of the stage is now the side of the stage. Now, my story really did shift this Lot's wife, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, because of course she's the one who rains down fire and brimstone. I've been asked a couple of times, I wouldn't even say it's happened that often when I speak about the book, why did you think you had a right to do this? Or who gave you permission to do this? And I honestly say, I don't understand what you're talking about. Of course I have permission to do this. This belongs to me. It belongs to each of us. It is not in heaven. It belongs to us. We can do this. This is, I hate to use this because it gets into politics, but it's an originalist versus textual richness kind of conversation. Do you believe that the text is static or not? And the truth is, Judaism has never believed that the text is static. It is a fallacy to say it's only static when women start intervening. That's the fallacy. The fallacy is it's never been static. We've always looked into it. The Bible does its own reconsiderations of earlier passages. The Talmudic rabbis come and they reconsider it. All of that's okay. But when women start to do it, stop. It's not allowed anymore. And you know what? That's just not true. Again, salty language censored. It's not true. That's where we say that can't be. It can't be that everything is okay until one group of people, happens to be over 50% of the population, starts to say, well, what about this? What if we look at it this way? What if we say, no, there's another way to think about this? What if we say, but what did she think? Now I want to, because I know we have to head into HerTorah now. Is that right? Am I getting my timing right? So I want to share for another second. And I want to go a little bit further. And I want to invite you to think about a passage that I did not consider. So in my story, which I hope you'll read, and I hope you'll reach out to me and tell me all the things you love and hate about it. And I do mean hate. Like, if you don't like it, let me know. I think that is wonderful feedback. Not because the story is going to change, but just because it means that I've gotten you thinking. And what writer doesn't want to know that they've gotten you thinking? Okay, so the story goes on. Lot goes and warns his sons-in-law, who, in opposition to Noah's sons who come onto the ark, say, no, everything's okay. We're not going to get out of here. Right. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law. They stay. They've sealed their fate. Up, take your wife and your 2 remaining daughters. We're now in verse 15. Lest you be swept away because of the iniquity of the city. So they go out and they go to another town. There's actually this, I'm going down in verse 19. You have been so gracious to your servant and have already shown me so much kindness in order to save my life. He's talking to the angel. But I cannot flee to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Verse 20, look, that town there is near enough to flee to. It is such a little place. Let me flee there. It's such a little place. And let my life be saved. Okay, so they go there. Now, I only went as far as the destruction in my story. Lot's wife and her daughters escape. And there's a little coda, which I'm not going to get into, which you can read and you can decide what you think about it. Lot, however, he goes to the town Zoar and Zoara, right? Zoar. And then he leaves and he goes up to the hills. And then this really important little moment happens that I just decided not to think about too much. And it's very famous. I don't know if you've heard of it. In verse 30, Lot went up from Zoar and settled in the hill country with his 2 daughters. Now, the hill country doesn't mean he's in a cave. He's in the hill country, meaning he set himself up there again. For he was afraid to dwell in Zoar, and he and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. So now it's saying, oh, no. He didn't just go to the hill country and like start being, a merchant or have cattle or whatever. He actually is living in a cave. And the older one said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to consort with us in the way of all the world. Come, this is verse 32. Let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we maintain life through our father. Verse 33, that night they made their father drink wine, and the older one went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. Verse 34, the next day the older one said to the younger, see, I lay with father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and you go and lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father. Verse 35, that night also they made their father drink wine, and the younger one went and lay with him. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. Thus the 2 daughters of Lot came to be with child by their father. And I'm going to stop there. That is the logical end to the Sodom story, this moment in the cave. In your breakout rooms, I want you to think about this section and say, what is happening here? Why is this the logical conclusion to the story? And what stories can we make from this moment? Because again, this is troubling. This is a troubling moment. The Bible, I like to say, is the original Game of Thrones, that it gets down and dirty. It is violent. It is sexually questionable. It really is about power and about the struggle for power. Here we have a moment that's troubling. So what do you make of it? Because I want to hear your thoughts. And if what story would you come up with from this section? So I'm going to let you go into your breakout rooms, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say when we come back.
Thank you, Michal. So we'll send everybody out to breakout rooms. We'll take about 10 minutes. During that time, think about how you would shift the spotlight, or what you want to think about, or what stories you want to tell about the story. Make sure to give each other space to talk, so everybody should have a chance to contribute. And, just remember our general rules of breakout rooms, right? To show respect for one another. If somebody tells you something personal, that's confidential, always. Okay, so now we'll send you out to breakout rooms. We'll come back in 10 minutes and we'll hear what you have to say and conclude.